This is Julie. David is my husband. I thought I'd try recording one of these. After all, Dave may have hiked the trail, but I assure you it was an endeavor shared by the whole family. We did most of our town chores that first night. We saved planning and packing food for the next day. I made sure he had lots of options for his food bag. The only other plans we had for Dave's first zero in 3 weeks was to head down to the Bend REI and then have a date night. He put on brand new shoes that he bought during his last zero, but this was over 500 miles earlier and they were all used up. He was thinking of getting a pair of Ultra Olympus shoes, but REI didn't have any. So he got the exact same size, model, and color shoe from last time. Date night was spent at the Bend Bunk and Brew. He wanted to introduce me to his people. The Bunk and Brew is popular with thru hikers in the summer and skiers in the winter. It had all the standard features for a hiker hostel, but also had 2 food trucks and a beer truck. They have live music on the night we were there. While we listened to the music and waited for our food, Peter, aka Tallboy, walked by. Dave had not seen him since South Lake Tahoe. Peter came off the trail earlier that day, about 50 miles ahead of where David did. He was going to take a zero the next day. Finding Peter and hanging out with him at the Bunk and Brew made the whole outing a lot more special for Dave. I had him back on the trail before 7 the next morning. For some reason, we forgot our traditional trailhead selfie. That first morning was cold and damp. The clouds hung close to the ground. Unless it was really cold, Dave doesn't wear a jacket. He just hikes in his sun hoodie and relies on the exercise to raise his temperature. This morning was challenging. He put on his gloves and beanie, though. Still, stopping even briefly caused him to get really cold, so he didn't take any breaks until the afternoon. When he took that afternoon break, it was quite a break. He entered the first of a few limited entry areas he would pass through in Oregon. This first one was called the Obsidian Limited Area Entry. Notice the shards of obsidian on the trail and this boulder of obsidian next to his pack. Then, out of the blue, there was an obsidian waterfall. Despite all the research Dave did on the PCT before hiking it, he knew nothing about this amazing natural feature. He was blown away. He had his lunch there and took numerous pictures and videos. Not long after exiting the Obsidian Limited Entry Area, he entered the Shale Lake Limited Entry Area. For the next couple of days, when he was near a cool place like a scenic lake where it would have been nice to camp, he couldn't. PCT hikers are allowed to hike through but not camp without a second permit in these limited entry areas. David managed 30 miles that first day and camped within sight of Mount Washington. The morning of the second day was damp and cold again. The top of Mount Washington barely peeked through the clouds. Just a mile into the new day, he crossed a highway at McKenzie Pass. Many hikers get off the trail there to resupply in Bend or Sisters. If we had thought of it, Dave could have slack-packed that day before and slept in a real bed another night. That's okay. Just 12 miles further and he'd reach the Big Lake Youth Camp, where he would get a shower and a free lunch. He'd seen these signs for a user trail not maintained a few times, but his first chance to walk on a user trail was to get to the youth camp. The youth camp is run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They have a director dedicated to just fulfilling the needs of PCT hikers as they pass. You can camp lakeside as well as hang out in their PCT lounge. The lounge has showers, Wi-Fi, laundry, hiker boxes, and is a place to pick up resupply boxes. Although some hikers complain that it is cult-like, David didn't bump up against this. The only thing vaguely religious, besides the incredible generosity, is the fact that the counselors sang grace before serving their free vegetarian meals. Speaking of meals, Lunch's main course was mac and cheese that had a cornflake crust. Dave went back for seconds and then thirds on the camp's encouragement. Apparently, each meal has an item that originates from a place where people are seeking refuge from. The day Dave was there, the item was a crispy herb bread from an African nation. The bread was delicious. The meal item was supposed to inspire generosity, kindness, and compassion. Lunch also had fresh vegetables and fruit. Dave only spent a couple hours there, but he left feeling rested and stuffed. Just outside of camp, he ran into a couple of trail angels and their dog. They were planning on camping in their RV for a week while they handed out trail magic. Dave was too full to eat, but he enjoyed a beer while he chatted with the angels and another hiker who got a burger cooked to order. After his post-meal digestive, he hiked through a snow-free snowmobile park. The street sign-like markers were high on poles so they could be read by the snowmobile riders when the trails were deep under snow. Around 4 p.m., he crossed a road at Santiam Pass. This is where Peter came off the trail just a couple of days earlier. This was the last convenient place to come off the trail to resupply in Bend. A last look back at Mount Washington and a view of Black Butte. Then Three-Fingered Jack started dominating the landscape. Adam, Dave's hiking partner from sections 12 and 20, once told him about how amazing a woodpecker's hearing is. Their beaks are connected directly to their skulls, so when they drill holes into the trees, they are literally pounding their heads against wood. Yet, their hearing is sensitive enough to hear the bugs crawling beneath the tree's bark. Due to his long lunch break, Dave only got 27 miles, but he found a lovely camping spot with an excellent view of the rising sun. Unfortunately, the ground was pretty wet. He left Three-Fingered Jack behind and set his sights on Mount Jefferson. One of the nice things about Oregon is that one can get internet access most of the day. This day he made reservations at the Timberline Lodge. He was really looking forward to this mid-section break. Despite being a pretty long section, 7 days, he touched civilization every day but this day. He woke up in Bend on the first day, he passed through the youth camp on the second day, and through Olali Lake Resort on the fourth. He'd stay at Timberline Lodge on the 5th and wake up in the lodge on the 6th. And finally, he'd arrive at Cascade Locks on the 7th. He spent the day in the Mount Jefferson wilderness traveling over the mountain's shoulder. He found places to relax at the many water crossings. Much of the water was full of silt. He tries not to run silty water through his filter to avoid ruining it. He hiked all day and into the night, managing to get another 30-mile day. The next morning, he said goodbye to Mount Jefferson. He was excited to get to Olali Lake Resort to have lunch and supplement his food bag a little. In his excitement, he managed to leave the PCT and find himself hiking a side trail down to Red Lake. This only added a little mileage, but added a disappointing amount of elevation loss and then gain to get to the resort. When he arrived, he was surprised to discover Peter was there. They had just seen each other in Bend, but they had lots to talk about, specifically their plans for getting to Cascade Locks. The lake was pleasant. He enjoyed the food, the beer, and the restroom. He was surprised to find Band-Aids that were perfect for the wound on his hand. He grabbed just enough supplies to get him to Cascade Locks on the Washington border. He had 3 chocolate muffins and an orange juice for a late breakfast, and then a couple of beers with Peter and the other hikers for a pre-lunch aperitif. Much too soon, he was hiking again. He hiked with Peter a little, but to maximize his time at the Timberline Lodge the next day, he'd have to hike further than Peter was planning on going. He said goodbye, and they agreed to hang out together at the lodge the next day. He passed through some reservation lands where Smokey reminded him to be safe. He found and ate his first huckleberries. He caught an image of this bird in mid-flight. He tried to get artistic with this shot. With Mount Jefferson behind him, he had just one more big mountain to go. He somehow entered the Mount Hood National Forest twice. He'd hike for nearly 15 hours, arriving at 9:25, which is the latest so far. From dusk into dark, and then into dark so dark that he needed his headlamp for the first time. In the dark, he met a not-so-little friend. He didn't drop his pack until 9:30, but he managed another 35 miles, which meant he had 25 miles the next day to get to the Timberline Lodge. He stealth camped just outside the Forpay Joe Graham horse camp. He took advantage of the campground's restrooms and picnic tables in the morning. The forest around Timothy Lake was full of bird songs. An informative pole at a road crossing warned of a high Bigfoot danger. At the busy Highway 26 road crossing, there was a parking lot with a restroom. Some trail angels were set up where he met this friendly dog. They were out of everything but Gatorade. The Gatorade was great, but the best trail magic was the high back camp chair. You really miss back support in the woods. The trail angels were set up north of Timberline the day before and had bestowed some trail magic on the Codgers. Dave was hoping to see the Codgers in Cascade Locks, but that just didn't happen. Climbing up after Highway 26, he got the first glimpses of Mount Hood. As he got closer, he discovered Mount Hood was just a giant pile of sand. This made the water very silty and the going slow at times. The Timberline Lodge is high on the slopes of Mount Hood. He didn't get to the lodge as early as he wanted because sandy slopes were slow going, but it was still daylight at 5:45. When he got to his room that was supposed to have a single set of European-style bunk beds, he discovered it had two sets. He already felt weird for staying in a room with two beds, but now he felt weirder. I'm not sure what is European about bunk beds. Perhaps the European part was the fact that the room had only a sink, and my husband had to use the communal restrooms for everything else. He took a shower and washed some of his clothes in the sink. The room had a fan he used to dry his wet things as he went out for dinner. The dining room was packed. He'd be lucky to get a table before closing, so he ate at the bar. When he settled in at the bar, he made contact with Peter, who had arrived in the camping area near the lodge. David talked Peter into sharing his spacious room where Peter should have felt comfortable, since the room and Peter were both European. You get weird cravings on the trail. Dave's latest one was for a martini, which the lodge's bar satisfied. David and Peter stayed in the bar pretty late. At one point, my husband, who had not been given a trail name yet, complained about this to Peter. David was prepared to show Peter a list of trail names he'd come up with, but without skipping a beat, Peter bestowed him with the name 30-foot. Apparently, David's 30-foot fall on that icy traverse really left an impression on Peter. After all, it was in that section north of Sonora Pass where David had met Peter. They didn't get a very early start the next day because the lodge doesn't start serving their buffet breakfast until 7 a.m. For many, the buffet at the Timberline Lodge is the highlight of the hike, so they weren't going to miss it. That being said, they were waiting to be seated when the dining room opened that morning. David and Peter hiked together the entire next day. The ski lifts were operating on Mount Hood, but not to lift skiers. Rather, mountain bikers were using the lifts to then ride down the many trails that crisscrossed the mountain. At one point, David and Peter were pretty sure they spotted Mount St. Helens. Peter was aware of an alternate route that would take them to a waterfall. Ramona Falls were amazing. Dave was fortunate to have Peter with him to ensure that he didn't miss out on this very popular lunch spot. David introduced Peter to huckleberries from the trailside bushes, but Peter wasn't impressed. He said they were like Johannesburg. Peter is an excellent photographer, and at one point he stopped David and took his portrait. I think it turned out terrific. At 4 p.m. they ran into some more trail magic. It was interesting that the trail angels left the site for a little hike as they arrived. So Peter and David were left alone with all the goodies. At 7 p.m., they ran into a little tent city. This is the highest concentration of tents David would see. To get within striking distance of Cascade Locks, they hiked into the dark again. There were spots for their tents adjacent to the trail on an abandoned dirt road. Impressively, even with a relatively late start, the boys got 29 miles. With a long and late day the day before, Peter chose to sleep in. On the other hand, David was excited to get to Cascade Locks. David would only spend 17 hours in Cascade Locks while Peter was planning on doing a 0 in the town the next day. David took the Eagle Creek alternative to the Cascade Locks. He hiked this with our older son in the spring of 2022. The trail down to Eagle Creek was a bit dicey, but you just don't get a chance to see a trail like Eagle Creek very often. The engineering of the trail is just amazing. Shortly after passing through the tunnel at Tunnel Falls, it got really crowded. He passed at least 200 people on the way to the parking lot. This soured him on the Eagle Creek Trail a little. To get from the Creek Trail to Cascade Locks proper, he took the Gorge Trail. On this trail, he found and ate his first blackberries so far. Huckleberries may taste better, but they are so much trouble to harvest. Blackberries have the best ROI. Seeing the monument in Cascade Locks, I have to agree with David. The sign at the Oregon-California border is so disappointing.
Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
David did the 16 miles to Cascade Locks by 1 p.m. His hotel room wasn't ready, so he had lunch at the Brigham Fish Market across the street. Laundry at the hotel was tough because he needed change, but you couldn't get it at the hotel proper. So he walked to the market where he ran into Peter as he came into town. Peter was going to camp on Thunder Island a little ways down the street. They agreed to meet up later to check out the arcade and have dinner at Thunder Island Brewing. With town chores complete, they met at the arcade where you pay a flat rate and play on MAME-style arcade cabinets. They had some artwork on sale that mashed up E.T. and Mr. T. Mr. E.T. was hilarious. I wish I had a place for it. At Thunder Bay Brewing, they got their Trail Magic beer and a huge dinner. David couldn't stay out late. He had a 6 a.m. bus to catch the next morning. He needed to get home so he could help send our older son off to Malaysia with his college friend Sashin for a very special summer trip. A few days later, we moved our younger son into college for his freshman year. David would be back in Cascade Locks a week later to catch the tail end of trail days. But unfortunately, he wouldn't see Peter on the trail again. Snake count 9. This little guy was on the Eagle Creek alternative. Trail stop checklist. Bend, check. McKenzie Pass, check. Big Lake Youth Camp, check. Santiam Pass, check. Olali Lake Resort, check. Timberline Lodge, check. Cascade Locks, check. That's a lot of checks.
All right. That's the ticket.